Do you think I'm pretty?
David's hands trembled slightly as he held the delicate photo frame. The CEO's office was silent, except for the hum of the computer he'd just fixed. Emma Sterling stood behind him, waiting. He turned slowly, the frame catching the light. Her eyes met his, those brilliant blue eyes that everyone said were cold as ice. "It's just, you look different here," he whispered. She stepped closer, vulnerability flooding her face for the first time. "Do you think I'm pretty?" The question hung between them like a confession. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the designer suit and the billion-dollar empire. "I think you're beautiful," he said honestly. "But before we find out what happens next, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from right now. Now let me tell you how David Hayes ended up in Emma Sterling's office that night, and why a simple question would change everything. David Hayes had learned that life doesn't always give you second chances. He'd learned that when he held his daughter Lily in the hospital 3 years ago, watching her cry for the only mother she'd ever known. His wife Sarah had been everything, vibrant, loving, the light that made their small apartment feel like home. They'd met in college, both broke, both dreaming of escaping the neighborhoods they'd grown up in. Sarah had been studying education, wanting to teach young children, wanting to shape minds in ways that mattered. David had been in his first tech support job, sitting in a cubicle and solving other people's computer problems while dreaming of something bigger, something more meaningful. But then Sarah had come along, and suddenly the dream shifted. They weren't dreaming of individual achievement anymore. They were dreaming together. Late nights in their tiny shared apartment, eating ramen on her futon, planning a life where they'd both be artists in their own way. Sarah through teaching, David through technology that could help people. They'd built something beautiful together in that cramped space, not just a life, but a partnership built on complete faith in each other. Sarah would leave him notes in his lunchbox, telling him how proud she was of him. David would surprise her by cleaning the entire apartment and having her favorite pasta waiting when she came home from long days at school. They'd sit on their fire escape and talk about the future. Maybe a house with a backyard, maybe 2 kids, maybe by the time they were 40, they'd have built something real and lasting. The future had felt infinite and full of possibility. Then Sarah got sick. It happened suddenly, the way the worst things always do. One day she was complaining about being tired, and the next she was in the hospital with tests and results that came back with words like aggressive and terminal, the kind of cancer that doesn't give you the mercy of time to prepare. One day you're planning a future, and the next day you're learning that the future has been cancelled without your permission. David had felt his entire world compress into a single moment. All those dreams, all those late-night conversations about what they'd build together, erased. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. He'd quit his job immediately. Career advancement meant nothing. He'd taken a leave of absence from the company, and when it became clear she'd need him permanently, they'd fired him. He was grateful, in a weird way. At least they'd made it simple. Sarah had needed him, and nothing else mattered. He'd worked double shifts at every place that would hire him: construction, retail, warehouse work, anything that paid cash or was flexible enough that he could take her to appointments. He'd sold things: his father's watch that his dad had given him before he died, a laptop he'd been saving for to update his skills, his car, which meant taking the bus everywhere with 2 suitcases of supplies for her treatments. He'd taken out loans he'd never be able to pay back, credit cards that maxed out, personal loans from friends that made him feel ashamed every time he ran into those friends. He'd fought with every ounce of strength he possessed, convinced somehow that if he worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, loved hard enough, he could will her back to health. He'd researched alternative treatments obsessively. He'd talked to every doctor who would see him. He'd prayed, even though he wasn't particularly religious, and he'd made deals with God that he knew God wouldn't make. But some battles can't be won with effort and love alone. Medicine isn't negotiable. Death doesn't care how much you sacrifice. When she died on a Tuesday morning in March, the nurses had let him stay in the room for hours afterward. He'd held her hand, which had gone cold and stiff, and he'd thought about how Lily was only 4 years old then, barely old enough to understand language, let alone the concept of death. His mother had been watching her. When David had called to tell his mother that Sarah was gone, she'd started crying, and then he'd had to comfort her while his own heart was breaking into pieces he wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. He'd held Sarah until they'd had to make him leave, and then he'd walked out of the hospital and hadn't cried for 3 weeks. He'd been numb in that way that people are when they've experienced the worst thing that can happen. He'd arranged the funeral on a budget that made him feel like he was failing her in death, the way he'd failed to save her in life. He'd organized the death certificates and filled out paperwork with a steady hand while his insides were screaming. He'd cleaned out her locker at the school where she'd taught, and 20 of her former students showed up at the funeral, each one a reminder that she'd changed lives, that she'd mattered deeply. He'd taken Lily to the funeral, even though his mother had suggested he not. He'd wanted Lily to say goodbye, to understand that her mother was gone, not just missing temporarily. At 4 years old, Lily hadn't really understood. She'd pointed at the casket and asked where Mommy's arms were, why Mommy wasn't moving, if they'd put Mommy in a box because she wasn't feeling well. David had answered each question honestly, feeling like he was destroying her innocence with every truth. He'd held her through the service, and he'd known in that moment that his job had changed. He wasn't just a husband who'd lost his wife. He was a parent who had to figure out how to raise a child alone, how to answer impossible questions, how to teach her that the world was both beautiful and devastating, and that she had to love anyway. 3 years had passed since that Tuesday in March. Lily was 7 now, in 2nd grade, and she'd stopped asking when Mommy was coming home. Somewhere around the 1-year mark, she'd shifted. She'd started asking other questions instead, harder questions in some ways. Do you think Mommy would be proud of me? Why do only some kids have moms? If people go to heaven when they die, why can't they send letters? Is it my fault that Mommy got sick? Did I make her sick somehow? Those last one had broken David's heart so completely that he'd cried for the first time in years. He'd held Lily and told her that it wasn't her fault, that sometimes bad things happen to good people, that none of it was about anything she'd done or not done. He'd told her that Mommy loved her completely, that Mommy would always be part of her, that she carried Sarah with her in the way she laughed, Sarah's laugh, the way she loved animals, Sarah's soft heart, the way she asked questions about everything, Sarah's brilliant mind. David had learned that grief has weight. It's not the poetic thing people talk about, something that gets lighter with time in a linear way. It's more like a stone in your chest that becomes your new normal. You don't stop carrying it, you just get stronger carrying it. You learn to breathe with it there. You learn to laugh even though it's present. You learn to move through the world even though part of you will always be standing in that hospital room, holding her hand, begging the universe to reverse what it's already decided is irreversible. The weight shifts sometimes. Some days it's bearable. Some days it's crushing. Some days you wake up for a few minutes and forget, and then it crashes back in, and you have to grieve all over again. After Sarah's death, David lost his job at the computer repair shop where he'd started working after his company fired him. The owner said he was distracted. What David heard was that he couldn't keep up, that his grief was inconvenient, that his suffering was affecting the business. He'd had a better position once, tech support for a mid-sized company, but he'd left it to care for Sarah during her final months. There were no guarantees in corporate America for people with dying wives. No one had an employee handbook section for what to do when your spouse is terminally ill. Companies wanted workers who could show up and be fully present. David was barely holding on. So David did what millions of single parents do. He started taking whatever work he could find. He became a janitor at Sterling Technologies, the gleaming glass building downtown where Emma Sterling's empire occupied the top 17 floors. The pay wasn't great, $28,000 a year before taxes, which was barely enough to cover rent, food and childcare, but it was stable. There was health insurance for Lily, which was everything. It meant that if she got sick like her mother had, they could afford to take her to a doctor. There was a 401k, though David barely understood how it worked and knew he'd never actually retire. There was routine, and routine was what kept him and Lily afloat. Routine meant he knew exactly what to expect. Routine meant he could plan his life around it. Routine meant there were still some things in the world he could control. The job meant early mornings and late nights, a relentless grind that David had learned to treat like meditation. His alarm went off at 5:30 every morning before the sun came up, before the city woke. He'd lie there for a moment, gathering the strength to move, gathering the courage to face another day of being both everything to Lily and invisible to everyone else. He'd splash cold water on his face, brew a pot of cheap coffee that tasted like regret, and then he'd go wake Lily. He'd sit on the edge of her small twin bed. They'd saved for months to buy her her own bed instead of sharing the couch, and he'd gently shake her shoulder. "Good morning, baby girl. Time to wake up," he'd say, and she'd groan and burrow deeper into her blankets. He'd do different voices, different accents, trying to make it fun instead of just another demand on a child who wanted to sleep. Sometimes he'd make up songs. "Rise and shine, it's breakfast time. We're gonna have a day so fine." He'd sing badly, and she'd laugh despite herself. Then came the rushed routine of getting her ready. She'd resist brushing her teeth. She'd change her clothes 3 times because she wanted to wear something that didn't match. She'd ask for braids, which took extra time, and David would do them even when he was running behind because she loved braids, because she loved having her father do them, because these small moments of care were what made her feel loved. He'd pack her lunch, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a banana, some crackers, a small juice box, and he'd include a note. Different notes every day. "You are smart and kind and brave. Love, Dad. Remember that you're special. Have a great day. Dad. I'm proud of you, Dad." He'd write these notes while she ate her cereal, and he'd sneak them into her lunchbox, and she'd come home and tell him that the other kids wanted notes from their parents too. Then the drop-off at school. He'd walk her to the bus stop, holding her hand, even though she was getting to the age where other kids thought holding your parents' hand was uncool. He'd wait until the bus came. He'd wave goodbye. He'd watch the bus pull away and feel the familiar ache in his chest, the worry that something would happen and he wouldn't be there, the knowledge that he was entrusting his most precious thing to someone else's care for 7 hours. Then he'd head to Sterling Technologies. The janitor job was shift work, 4 p.m. to midnight, which meant he could be at school pickup at 3. After he picked Lily up at the after-school program, they'd go home. She'd do her homework while he made dinner. Nothing fancy, usually something that could stretch. Chicken and rice, pasta with sauce, tacos. He'd help her with reading assignments, which she loved, her eyes following the words as his finger traced across the page. Then he'd get her ready for bed. Bath time, pajamas, teeth brushed. A story, always. Sometimes the same story 3 nights in a row, because she loved it, and he loved the excuse to be close to her. He'd sing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," even though his voice was terrible, and she'd giggle and tell him he was bad at singing. He'd tuck her in, kiss her forehead, and whisper, "I love you to the moon and back." She'd answer, "I love you to the stars and beyond," and he'd leave the nightlight on and leave the door cracked open so he could hear if she needed him. Then at 6 p.m., he'd have to leave her with a babysitter, a neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who charged $10 an hour and was the nicest person he'd ever met. He'd pay her cash, money he didn't have, because what was the alternative? Lily couldn't stay home alone. The anxiety of leaving her, even with someone as trustworthy as Mrs. Rodriguez, never went away. What if there was an emergency? What if she needed him? He'd give Mrs. Rodriguez his cell phone number, though it was a cheap, prepaid phone that dropped calls. He'd make sure Lily was settled before he left, that she had her stuffed animal, that she knew Mrs. Rodriguez would keep her safe. Then came work. 4 hours of cleaning before the building really emptied, moving through hallways that were still occupied, trying to be as invisible as possible. He'd clean bathrooms, scrubbing toilets and sinks, refilling soap and paper towels, never making eye contact if someone came in. He'd empty trash cans from every office, wheeling a huge bin on a cart that was heavy and awkward. He'd sweep and mop hallways, dealing with spilled coffee and mysterious stains, and the small indignities of being the person who cleaned up after everyone else. His hands would get raw from the chemicals, his back would ache from bending and lifting, his knees would hurt from kneeling to clean baseboards. But David didn't mind the invisibility, or he'd learned to convince himself that he didn't. He used the quiet hours to think. The repetitive work was almost meditative. His hands would work while his mind drifted. He'd think about Lily, about how she was growing up so fast. One day she was 4 years old, losing her mother, and now she was 7 and asking philosophical questions about death and meaning. He'd think about how he wanted more for her than this, than a tiny apartment that was always too cold in winter, hand-me-downs from garage sales, worried conversations about money that he'd tried to shield her from, but knew she heard anyway. He'd think about her future, about what he wanted for her life, about how he could make sure that she'd be okay, that she'd grow up believing in herself. On top of the janitor job, he'd taken a second job on weekends, Uber driving, which meant he'd pick up passengers on Friday and Saturday nights, use his old car that was barely running, and try to maintain a 4.9 rating so his account wouldn't get deactivated. This meant less sleep, maybe 5 hours a night on average, but more money in the emergency fund. He'd saved about $3,000, which was almost enough for a month of rent and food and utilities if an emergency came. Almost enough, but never quite. He'd taken a community college class at night too, one that he could take online. He wanted to get better credentials, to eventually get out of janitor work and into something that paid better. But the classes were hard when he was this tired, hard when he was this stressed. He'd read through material for his online class during his breaks at work, squinting at his phone screen, trying to absorb information about systems administration. He'd started looking into better schools for Lily, researching scholarships, planning futures. There was a charter school across town that had an excellent science program, and Lily was a science kid. She wanted to be a marine biologist, wanted to study dolphins and whales and the ocean. He'd filled out the charter school application with hope in his chest and fear underneath it. If Lily got in, he'd have to figure out how to get her there. More transportation costs, more time lost. But if she didn't get in, what did that say? That his daughter wasn't smart enough? That the world was already sorting her into a category of less than? What kept David going wasn't hope exactly, but something smaller and more resilient. It was the way Lily hugged him every morning. It was her laugh when he did bad voices while reading her bedtime stories. It was the knowledge that she needed him to be strong, and so he would be. David was the kind of man who noticed things. He noticed when Mrs. Chen from accounting started bringing lunch instead of buying the expensive sandwich from the food truck. Her husband must have had a health issue. He noticed when Tom from IT worked 18-hour days before the big launch, stress showing in the way he gripped his coffee cup. He noticed when Emma Sterling stopped laughing. He'd only seen her laugh once in the break room before she noticed him, and then her face had gone carefully blank. Her reputation was ice cold. The papers called her ruthless. Her competitors feared her. But David, emptying the trash outside her office, had heard her crying late one night, trying to muffle the sound. He'd walked away, giving her privacy, but he'd never forgotten it. Emma Sterling had built her empire on logic and control, which was fitting because logic and control were the only things that had ever kept her safe. She'd been born poor, bone-deep poor, the kind where you worry about heating in winter and share a bedroom with 2 siblings, and your mother works 3 jobs and still can't make rent. There were mornings when there was no milk for cereal, when her mother would leave money on the counter for lunch and Emma would save it, eating nothing at school so she could take it back home to contribute to groceries. She'd been 9 years old and already learning that love was measured in sacrifice, that survival required mathematics. Emma had been hungry in ways that went beyond physical. She'd been hungry for more, for better, for proof that poverty was a choice and not a destiny. She'd watched her mother work herself to exhaustion for barely enough money to survive, and she'd decided that would not be her life. While other kids were playing, Emma was reading. While they slept 8 hours, she slept 4 and studied. She'd gotten straight A's. She'd joined debate team and speech competitions. She'd made herself into someone who couldn't be dismissed, who couldn't be ignored, who had value precisely because she'd earned it through unrelenting effort. She'd gone to university on full scholarship, one of the few things she'd allowed herself to feel proud about. But there was no time for the pride to settle. She was working her way through, sleeping 4 hours a night for 4 years, which meant she was sleeping while her roommate was sleeping, studying while her roommate was partying, working while her roommate was in class. She'd earned enough to help her mother, sending money home monthly, which meant not buying winter clothes or new shoes. Her feet hurt constantly. Her hands got broken out from the cheap soap, but she kept going. She'd learned code when most people her age were partying, discovering who they were through late nights with friends and first loves and mistakes. Emma was discovering who she could become through late nights with textbooks and practice problems and elegant solutions to complex systems. She'd learned business when most were learning how to fail, how to recover from failures, how to be human. Emma was learning the architecture of power, how capital flowed, how to position herself to redirect that flow toward herself. By 28, she'd started Sterling Technologies from a basement with 2 other people. One of them had tried to sue her when the company got its first major investment, claiming he was entitled to more equity because he'd been there from the beginning. She'd had a lawyer demolish him. She'd learned that mercy was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. By 35, she'd built Sterling Technologies into a $9 billion enterprise. She owned the building where David cleaned floors. She had power. She had wealth. She had respect. She had offices on the top 17 floors of the building and a net worth that made her one of the most powerful women in the world. She had nothing that mattered. The loneliness of Emma's success was a thing so profound it had become part of her, woven into her cells like a scar that had healed over but never really gone away. She'd learned early that relationships were transactions and that understanding had calcified into truth. Her first boyfriend in college, someone she genuinely cared about, had asked to borrow money and then had disappeared with it. $20,000 she'd saved from her work-study job and summer internships. She'd learned that love was a liability. Her college best friend, someone she'd told secrets to in the dark of their dorm room at 2 a.m, had sold stories about Emma's childhood, about her mother, about the time Emma had cried in her arms about how much pressure she felt. Those stories had ended up in a tabloid with the headline, "From Rags to Riches, the harsh childhood of Tech's Ice Queen." Emma had seen herself reduced to a narrative, her pain commodified, and she'd never forgotten that. Her first business partner had tried to sue her out of the company during the explosive growth phase. He'd claimed that she'd changed agreements, that he'd been pushed out, that the success was partially his. The lawsuit had been frivolous, but it had cost her money and time and energy to fight it. She'd won, and she'd destroyed him professionally, made sure no other company would hire him, made sure he couldn't raise capital. Some people thought it was ruthless. Emma thought it was fair. He'd tried to take what was hers. She'd taken his future. That seemed proportional. She'd learned that people wanted her money, her connections, or both. No one wanted her. She'd learned that if she was ever going to be safe, if she was ever going to be secure, she'd have to be impenetrable. So she'd built walls so high and so thick that no one could get through. She'd built them from years of disappointment, from lessons learned the hard way, from the understanding that vulnerability was a weapon other people would use against her. She'd become the kind of woman who never smiled in meetings, never socialized, never gave anyone ammunition. She was professional. She was distant. She was untouchable. She was alone in a building full of people who would have done anything to be close to her, not understanding that closeness was the one thing she couldn't afford. Emma lived in a penthouse apartment that occupied an entire floor of a luxury building in the most expensive part of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides showed the city spread beneath her like something she owned but couldn't touch, something she'd conquered but couldn't possess in any meaningful way. The apartment was decorated by an interior designer, all clean lines and expensive nothing, a space that looked like it was meant for someone, but Emma wasn't sure who. The furniture was comfortable, but looked like no one actually sat on it. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal items, nothing that suggested a human lived there. It was a showcase, not a home. She had housekeepers who came on Thursdays when she was guaranteed to be at work, so she didn't have to interact with them. They'd clean everything to perfection and leave no trace of their presence. She had a personal chef who came 3 times a week and left meals in her refrigerator in perfectly portioned containers with reheating instructions. She had a therapist. She paid $1,500 per hour to listen to her carefully constructed explanations of why she was fine, completely fine, totally fine, while the therapist took notes and said things like, "And how does that make you feel?" as if feelings were something Emma could simply access like a spreadsheet. At night, when she wasn't working, she'd stand at her windows and watch the city below. She'd watch families walking down streets, parents holding children's hands, children dragging their parents toward ice cream shops, the casual physical affection that Emma had only experienced from her mother, who was too busy working to give much of anything but the occasional exhausted hug. She'd watch couples walking arm in arm, leaning into each other, and she'd wonder what that felt like. To matter to someone not because of what you could provide, but just because you existed. To have someone care about your day, not because it affected their finances, but because they genuinely wanted to know how you felt. She'd had relationships, though Emma called them something else in her head. Arrangements was a better word. There was the hedge fund manager who was good-looking and ambitious and wanted to be seen with her because she was famous and powerful. They'd gone to charity events together. They'd looked good in photographs. They'd had pleasant sex that felt like a negotiated transaction, both people showing up, both people performing their assigned roles, no one getting hurt because no one was really present. There was the venture capitalist who'd wanted her connections more than her. She'd given them to him, and he'd moved on to someone younger and more connected. 3 years before David saw her photo, Emma had ended her last relationship, though ended implied there had been a beginning that meant something. It was more of a merger between 2 people who wanted the same benefits and none of the vulnerability. They'd seen each other twice a month in his apartment, had pleasant sex that was technically proficient but emotionally empty, and had never once said, "I love you." They talked about their businesses and their investments and their vacation properties. They'd never talked about what scared them, what they wanted, what they felt when they were alone. When he'd told her he was moving on, dating a fashion model who made more money than he did, Emma had felt nothing. She'd deleted his number and thought nothing of it. She'd checked her email and returned to work. That was when she'd truly understood that she was broken, that something in her was fundamentally wrong. Because normal people felt something when relationships ended. Normal people cried or got angry or felt relief or sadness. Normal people had messy emotions and complicated feelings. Emma felt efficiency. She felt the logical assessment that this arrangement was no longer beneficial and that it was appropriate to terminate it. She felt nothing else, and that emptiness terrified her more than anything ever had. So Emma had thrown herself into work with renewed purpose. She'd made a bigger empire. She'd pushed harder. She'd been brilliant and ruthless, and exactly what the business world rewarded. She'd negotiated deals that saved the company billions. She'd cut departments that weren't profitable. She'd fired people who weren't performing, and she'd done it without flinching because emotions had no place in business, and the emptiness had grown. It had become a companion, a roommate in her penthouse, a weight in her chest that she'd learned to carry the way you carry grief, not expecting it to go away, just learning to function despite it. She'd wake up in her expensive bed in her expensive apartment and feel the weight before she'd opened her eyes. She'd go to work and ignore it. She'd come home and stand at her window and acknowledge it. She'd made $7 billion and couldn't buy what she actually wanted, which was someone to see her. Not her bank account, not her achievements, not the version of her that appeared in Forbes articles. Someone to see her, the girl who'd been hungry and scared, the woman who'd sacrificed everything for nothing, the person underneath all the armor who was dying of loneliness. Emma Sterling wanted to know if she was still worth something when stripped of all her accomplishments. And she was terrified that the answer was no. The night David fixed Emma's computer should have been unremarkable. It was 11:30 on a Tuesday, the kind of night where the building was mostly empty, where the cleaning staff had the hallways to themselves, where work could be done without the pressure of being watched. Emma was working late. She always worked late, in her executive office on the 45th floor. Her days followed a predictable rhythm, office at 6 a.m. Board meetings, strategy sessions, investor calls, then back to her office to actually work, to handle the complex decisions that moved billions of dollars around like chess pieces. The view from her desk showed the city glittering beneath her, millions of lights representing millions of lives, and she felt no connection to any of them. She'd been working on the quarterly earnings report for 2 hours, fine-tuning projections, analyzing margins, looking for inefficiencies. The report was going to the board the next morning, and it needed to be perfect. Everything Emma did needed to be perfect. Perfectionism wasn't a choice for her. It was a survival mechanism. One mistake, one missed detail, one sign of weakness, and people would see her for what she feared she was underneath the armor: lost, scared, fundamentally inadequate. Then her computer had made a grinding sound that made her stomach drop. Not the soft hum of the fans, but something mechanical and terminal. She'd pressed the power button. Nothing. She'd held it down. The screen had flickered once, then gone black. Emma had felt panic for just a moment before she'd locked it down, compartmentalized it, dealt with it. She'd called building security and asked for someone from maintenance to come fix it immediately. The reports needed to go to the board the next morning. Without them, there would be questions. Without the reports, there would be vulnerability. Without the reports, she would fail. She'd called while sitting in the dark office. She preferred to work with just the desk lamp on, the rest of the office in shadow. The security guard had said someone would be up shortly. Emma had returned to pacing, which is what she did when she was anxious, though she would never admit to being anxious. She was calm. She was controlled. She was never uncertain. David had received the call on his radio. "We need maintenance on the 45 floor. Ms. Sterling's office. Computer issue." His stomach had dropped a little. He'd never been to the executive floors. He'd only cleaned the lower levels, bathrooms, break rooms, hallways where he was supposed to be invisible, where he existed in the margins. The executive floors were a different world. He'd taken the elevator up, leaving his cleaning cart on the 4th floor with a co-worker. His uniform was a simple grey shirt with Sterling Technologies printed on the back, slightly faded from washing. His name tag read David H., because using David Hayes seemed too familiar, too much like he was trying to be seen. The elevator doors opened on the 45 floor, and it was like stepping into another world. The lower floors were functional, carpeted hallways, standard offices, adequate lighting. This floor was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city from nearly the top of the building, the view so expansive and beautiful it seemed to belong to someone else. The hallway was all clean lines and expensive materials. There were only a few offices up here, which meant each one was enormous, significant, important. David felt his nervousness spike. He'd been around rich people before, at least as someone who cleaned up after them, but Emma Sterling was different. Emma Sterling was the reason the building existed. Emma Sterling had built an empire that made her one of the most powerful people in the world. He found her office at the end of the hallway. The door was open. Light spilled out. Emma was standing at the window, looking out at the city, and David had a moment of just seeing her before she noticed him. She was still wearing her work clothes, a dark blazer and tailored pants, but she'd removed her shoes and was standing in stockinged feet. Her hair, which was usually pinned back in a severe style, had been loosened and hung past her shoulders. She looked less like the Forbes cover and more like a person, which somehow made her more intimidating. She turned when she heard him, and her face shifted into professional mode. "Thank you for coming so late," she said, and her voice was colder than he expected, businesslike, the voice of someone who'd learned that warmth was a liability. "My computer died. I have reports due to the board tomorrow morning, and I need the data recovered." David nodded, trying to be as professional as possible. "I'll do my best. Let me take a look." He approached the desk carefully, aware that he was stepping into her space, aware that his worn shoes and grey shirt probably looked shabby against the backdrop of her expensive office. The computer was on the desk, dark and dead. He tried the power button. Nothing. He felt the relief of having something to focus on, a problem he could actually solve. "What were you working on when it died?" "Quarterly earnings report, millions of data points. I haven't backed it up to the cloud yet because it's not finished." She delivered the information clinically, but David heard the stress underneath. This mattered to her. More than just the work, the material, there was something else. Something about control, about needing things to be perfect, about the fragility of that control. "Okay, let's not panic," David said, and then immediately worried he sounded condescending. "Hard drives are often salvageable even when the computer won't turn on. Can I open this up?" Emma nodded, and he started working. He used a small toolkit he'd brought, removed the case, and examined the drive. The sound it had made, the grinding. It meant the drive was failing, the head was crashing into the platter, data was being destroyed even now. But David had recovered data from worse situations. He worked methodically, aware that Emma was watching him, aware that she was nervous, even if her face didn't show it. He worked for almost an hour, getting the data off the failing drive, using an external enclosure to read it, creating a backup. Emma didn't sit down. She stood, pacing sometimes standing at the window. She'd asked questions at first. "Is it lost? Can you get it back? How long will this take?" But after David's initial answers, she'd fallen silent. He'd filled the silence by working and by talking, softly, about what he was doing. The mechanical failure has damaged some sectors, but the core data should be intact. I'm using a recovery algorithm that should reconstruct the file system. These things usually work fine. He'd meant it to be reassuring, but Emma had just nodded, still tense, still afraid. Finally, the files were backed up. David had transferred everything to a new external drive, which he'd handed to Emma. Your data is here. It's all recoverable. You should be good to go for your reports. Emma had taken the drive from him, and their fingers had almost touched, and there'd been a moment of something, though David couldn't have named it. Thank you, Emma had said, and the professional tone had cracked slightly. I don't know what I would have done if... She'd stopped herself, reassembled her armor. This is exactly what I needed. David had been packing up his tools when he'd noticed the laptop on her bookshelf. It was closed, and the screensaver was cycling through images on the monitor that was powered by the backup drive. Beach scenes. A woman laughing on a beach. The same woman, but younger, looser, happier. David had frozen as the image had cycled. It was Emma. It was definitely Emma. But not the Emma standing in front of him in the sterile executive office. This Emma was barefoot, holding a puppy, wearing a sundress, genuinely smiling, genuinely present in her own body. He'd stared at the image, and Emma had noticed. She'd watched his face as it registered surprise and something else, something that felt like recognition, though of what he couldn't say. Recognition of possibility, maybe. Recognition that there was another Emma underneath the armor, a version of her that had existed at some point and might still exist somewhere inside. The moment had stretched between them, charged with something neither of them could name. Emma had looked away first, had gone to the window, but David had still been holding the image in his mind. That woman, that smile, that person who seemed impossible and real at the same time. That was a long time ago, Emma had said quietly, to the window, to the city, to no one in particular. David had turned to look at her, and he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Sadness, loneliness, something breaking inside her. He'd asked before he'd thought better of it, asked in the gentle way he asked Lily questions, genuinely curious, genuinely trying to understand. Who is that person? Emma had turned back from the window, and her face had been so vulnerable, so exposed, that David had almost regretted asking. Someone I used to be, she'd said softly. And then something remarkable had happened. Emma had asked him a question that seemed to cost her everything. She'd looked at him, and her walls had cracked, and she'd asked, "Do you think I'm pretty?" The words had come out soft, almost like a question she was asking herself, but she'd asked it to him. Does this matter? Do I matter? If I'm not the person on the beach, if I'm not happy, do I matter at all? David had understood suddenly what she was asking, what she was really asking underneath the question. She was asking if she was enough. Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as an achievement, but as a person. And the answer came to him with absolute clarity. He'd set down his tools. He'd looked at her the way he'd looked at the photo, really looked at her, trying to see past the armor and the designer clothes and the billion-dollar empire. He'd looked at her and seen a woman who was terrified and brave and lonely and searching. He'd looked at her and seen someone worth loving. "I think you're beautiful," he'd said, and he'd meant it. "But I also think that person on the beach was smiling, and you don't smile much anymore. I think you're brilliant and powerful and impressive, but I also think you're really sad. And I think the saddest part is that you don't believe anyone would like you if you weren't impressive. But someone could. Someone would." Emma had felt tears prick her eyes, which never happened. In all the years of her adult life, the years of stress and pressure and loneliness, she'd managed to not cry, She'd learned that crying was weakness. But something about this man, this kind-looking maintenance worker who'd fixed her computer and seen her photo and looked at her like she was worth seeing, had broken through. She'd turned away quickly, confused by the feeling, terrified by the vulnerability. "The computer is almost done," David had said gently. 2 more minutes. But everything had changed in those 2 minutes. When David had finished and had been packing up his tools, Emma had found herself asking questions she'd never asked anyone. "Do you work here full-time?" When he'd said yes, she'd asked, "What's your name?" Really, not just what the tag says. His face had changed when she'd asked, like he was surprised she wanted to know. He'd smiled and said, "David Hayes. I'm 38. I have a 7-year-old daughter named Lily. My wife died 3 years ago." The words had tumbled out like he was offering her his life story as proof of something, as proof that real people existed and worked in her building and had real problems and real loves and real losses, as proof that vulnerability didn't have to destroy you. Emma had felt something shift in her chest, a wall cracking. "Is it hard, being a single parent?" she'd asked, and she genuinely wanted to know. Not as a CEO evaluating an employee, but as a human being genuinely curious about someone else's life. David had considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. "Yeah," he'd admitted. "Sometimes it's really hard. I'm tired all the time. I worry about whether I'm doing enough for her. I feel like I'm failing sometimes. But Lily is worth it. Every hard day is worth it for her. I'd sacrifice anything for her, and I'd do it gladly." Emma had thought about that answer long after David had left. She'd thought about a man working as a janitor because his daughter was more important than his pride, because his love for her mattered more than his status. She'd thought about someone choosing connection over comfort, love over achievement. She'd thought about the way he'd looked at her like she was more than a net worth, more than a company, more than the things she'd built. He'd looked at her like she was a person worth knowing. David had frozen. He'd stared at the photo. Emma had noticed his reaction and had come around the desk to look. She'd watched his face register surprise and something else, something like recognition. Recognition of what? She couldn't say. The moment had stretched between them, charged with something she couldn't name. "That was a long time ago," Emma had said quietly. David had turned to look at her, and his expression had been so open, so genuine that Emma had felt her walls crack slightly. "Who is that person?" he'd asked. Not unkindly, not mockingly, genuinely curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Emma had looked at her own photo, at that girl on the beach who seemed like someone from another life. "Someone I used to be," she'd said. And then, in a moment of vulnerability so profound it terrified her, Emma had done something she'd never done. She'd asked someone to see her. "Do you think I'm pretty?" The words had come out soft, almost like a question she was asking herself. David had set down the laptop. He'd looked at her, really looked at her, the same way he'd looked at the photo, and something in his eyes had changed. "I think you're beautiful," he'd said, "but I also think that person on the beach was smiling, and you don't smile much anymore." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. Emma had felt tears prick her eyes, which never happened, and she'd turned away quickly, confused by the feeling. "The computer is almost done," David had said gently. 2 more minutes. In those 2 minutes, everything had shifted. When David had finished and had been packing up his tools, Emma had found herself asking questions. "Do you work here full-time?" When he'd said yes, she'd asked, "What's your name?" Really, not just what the tag says. He'd smiled and said, "David Hayes. I'm 38. I have a 7-year-old daughter named Lily. My wife died 3 years ago." The words had tumbled out like he was offering her his life story as proof of something, as proof that real people existed and worked in her building and had real problems and real loves and real losses. Emma had asked, "Is it hard, being a single parent?" David had considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. "Yeah," he'd admitted, "sometimes it's really hard. I'm tired all the time. I worry about whether I'm doing enough for her. I feel like I'm failing sometimes. But Lily is worth it. Every hard day is worth it for her." Emma had thought about that answer long after David had left. She'd thought about a man working as a janitor because his daughter was more important than his pride, because his love for her mattered more than his status. She'd thought about someone choosing love over comfort, vulnerability over armor. She'd thought about the way he'd looked at her like she was more than a net worth. She'd thought about how she'd broken down in front of him, asked him if she was pretty, and instead of judgment, she'd gotten kindness. After that night, Emma couldn't stop thinking about David Hayes. It was illogical and inefficient, which bothered her precisely because she was always logical and efficient. Logic told her that she was the CEO, and he was a janitor, and they existed in different worlds that shouldn't intersect. Logic told her that any pursuit of something with him was impractical and would end badly. But logic was losing to something stronger, something that felt like hunger, something that felt like possibility. She found herself walking past the hallway where he worked, hoping to see him, studying his schedule so she'd know when he'd be cleaning her floor. She'd wait until he arrived and then make an excuse to walk past. Sometimes he'd nod at her. Sometimes he'd smile, that kind, open smile. Sometimes she'd feel her entire carefully constructed world shift and rearrange itself around the hope of seeing him, but she couldn't just bump into him forever. That wasn't how Emma Sterling operated, so she began intentionally breaking things in her office. Small things, carefully chosen things, a lamp that flickered, a phone connection that kept dropping, a drawer that stuck. She submitted maintenance requests, knowing he would respond. She wasn't proud of the manipulation, but she was compelled by something stronger than pride, stronger than her carefully maintained image. She needed to see him again. She needed to know if that moment in the office had been real or if she'd imagined it, if he was as real and kind as she remembered, or if she'd elevated him beyond what he actually was. David had noticed. Of course he had. The CEO of Sterling Technologies didn't usually request maintenance 3 times in 1 week unless something was seriously wrong. He'd mentioned it to his co-worker Marcus, who'd laughed and said, "Dude, she's probably just looking for an excuse to see you." David had dismissed it. He wasn't anyone worth seeing. He was a janitor with a dead wife and a daughter he was struggling to provide for. But he'd taken the maintenance requests seriously anyway, done the work carefully, and tried not to think about the look on Emma's face when she'd asked if she was pretty. When he'd arrived for the 4th request in 2 weeks, a flickering light fixture that was probably just a bulb, he'd found Emma waiting in the hallway instead of in her office. She'd been nervous, which was unusual for her. Her hands had been clenched. She'd been dressed more casually than usual, a simple sweater, her hair down, and she'd looked younger, less armored. "Hi," she'd said, and her voice had sounded uncertain, which was maybe the first true emotion he'd ever heard from her. "I was wondering if you'd like to have coffee sometime." David had been shocked. He'd looked at her, really looked at her, and had seen someone terrified and hopeful and brave, and his heart had done something complicated in his chest. He'd wanted to say no. It was inappropriate. She was his boss. It would end badly. But instead, he'd heard himself say, "I'd like that." They'd met at a coffee shop that Emma usually wouldn't have been seen in. Too casual, too public, but she'd suggested it, and David had agreed. It was a Saturday afternoon, which meant he'd had to leave Lily with Mrs. Rodriguez, which meant he'd felt guilty the entire way there. But he'd needed to see Emma. He'd needed to know if what had happened in her office was real or something his lonely, grieving mind had imagined. Emma had arrived 15 minutes early, which suggested she was nervous. She'd been waiting at a small table in the corner, far from the window. She'd arrived in designer jeans and a simple sweater, her hair down, and she'd looked like the woman from the beach photo, if that woman had learned how to be tired and scared. She'd looked like someone about to do something that terrified her. "Hi," David had said, and she'd looked up at him with an expression of such relief and longing that he'd known immediately that his mind hadn't imagined it. "I'm glad you came." "Of course I came," Emma had said. "I've been looking forward to this all week." They'd talked for 3 hours until the coffee shop was starting to close. David had told her about Lily, how she loved reading, how she could spend hours with a book about sea creatures, how she wanted to be a marine biologist and explore the ocean. He'd told her about the difficult parts too, the parts that weren't cute or inspiring. How Lily had asked him if he would die, if she would be alone like him. How she'd cried the night before her school science fair because she'd wanted her mother there to see her project. How David had held her and hadn't known what to say except, "I know, baby, I know." He'd told Emma about Sarah, about how bright she'd been, how full of light. He'd told her that some mornings he woke up and forgets that she's dead, and then remembers, and the grief hits him all over again like he's just learned she died. He'd told Emma that he didn't know if he'd ever stop loving his wife, and he didn't want to, because forgetting her would feel like a betrayal. Emma had listened the way some people listen to Holy Scripture, like every word was redemption. She hadn't offered platitudes. She hadn't told him he'd move on, or that he'd find someone else, or any of the things people usually said. She'd just listened, and her listening had felt like the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. Then David had asked her questions, and Emma had struggled at first. She wasn't used to talking about herself as a person, only as an achievement. But slowly, carefully, she'd tried to answer him honestly for the first time in her adult life. She'd told him about being poor, bone-deep poor, the kind where you're hungry and you don't tell anyone because you're ashamed. She'd told him about her mother working 3 jobs and still not making it. She'd told him about her siblings, about the pressure she'd felt to be the one who made it out, who proved that poverty wasn't inevitable, that hard work could save you. She'd told him about the relentless drive, the exhaustion, the years of sacrifice, the loneliness that had come with building an empire. "I thought if I had enough money," she'd said, "I'd feel safe. I thought if I was powerful enough, no one could hurt me. I thought if I was successful enough, people would want to be near me, that I'd finally be enough." She'd paused, looked down at her coffee. None of it worked. "I have everything," she'd said, "and I'm miserable. I'm so miserable I can barely function sometimes, and I don't even know why I'm telling you this. You work for me. You could use this against me. You could take this story to someone and ruin me with it." The vulnerability in that statement had cost her something. David had seen it in the way she'd said it, the fear underneath. She'd been offering him weapons. She'd been trusting him not to use them. David had reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was a simple gesture, his large, work-worn hand covering her manicured one. It was a gesture of protection, of promise, of presence. It had undone her. "I won't," he'd said quietly. "I promise you, Emma, I will never hurt you. I will never use this against you. I will never tell anyone anything you've told me. You're safe with me. That's a promise." Emma had felt something break open inside her. Not shatter, but open, like a door in a wall that had been sealed shut, finally unlocked. She'd looked at his face, at the kindness there, the genuine care, and she'd believed him. "How do you know?" she'd asked. "How do you know you can trust me to keep your promise? People promise things all the time." David had smiled a little. "Because you're asking the question. Because you're scared. Because real people are scared sometimes, and they ask real questions, and they show up anyway. That's how I know." The connection between them had deepened after that. David had started visiting Emma's office during his late-night shifts, and she'd started staying late when she knew he was working. They'd talk while he worked, and it had become their time. Emma had asked about Lily, really asked, not in the way people ask to be polite, but in the way someone asks when they actually want to know. David had brought photos on his phone. Lily with her first loose tooth, Lily at the aquarium, Lily drawing pictures of what she wanted to be when she grew up. Emma had looked at each photo like it was a window into something pure and true. One night, in the middle of winter, Lily had gotten sick. It started as a cough on a Thursday morning, the kind of cough that made David's stomach clench because he remembered Sarah coughing, remembered how illness could spiral. The doctor said it was viral, nothing serious, probably resolve in a few days with rest and fluids. But David couldn't shake the anxiety. He'd called in to work, had taken Lily to the doctor, had spent that night beside her bed in their small apartment, listening to her cough, ready to take her to the emergency room at any sign of complications. He'd played soft music to help her sleep. He'd checked her temperature obsessively. He'd held her when she was frightened. The next morning she'd seemed a little better, but she was still feverish. David had stayed home again. He'd called Emma's office to tell her he wouldn't be coming in. He'd expected a professional response. Instead, Emma had picked up her own phone. "Is Lily okay?" she'd asked immediately, before he'd even finished explaining. "She's sick," David had said. "Nothing serious, but I need to be here." "Of course you do," Emma had said, and her voice had been full of such warmth and understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll have someone cover your shift." He'd missed 3 days of work. During those 3 days, Emma had texted him asking for updates. She'd asked how Lily was feeling, what her symptoms were, had she seen a doctor. David had found himself looking forward to her messages, had found himself thinking of her as part of his life in a way he hadn't expected. When he'd returned to work, Emma had called him into her office. His heart had started racing. He'd worried he was in trouble, worried that he'd overstepped somehow, that the kindness had been temporary. But when he'd walked in, he'd found something that had stolen his breath. A new humidifier, one of those expensive ultrasonic ones that cost more than David made in 2 weeks. A bundle of books. Books Lily had mentioned wanting when she talked to Emma about marine biology. "I've read about bioluminescent creatures," Lily had said during one of their conversations, and Emma had remembered. A gift card to the pharmacy, and a note in Emma's careful handwriting that said, "For anything she needs, E." David had stood there holding the gifts, not knowing what to say. His hands had started to shake. "You did this?" he'd asked, though of course he knew the answer. "I wanted to make sure you had what you needed," Emma had said quietly. She'd been sitting at her desk, but she'd stood up when he'd entered, and now she was looking at him with such tenderness that his heart had done something complicated in his chest. David had understood immediately that it was Emma, but more than that, he'd understood what it meant. Here was a woman with $9 billion who was worried about his daughter's health, who'd paid attention to what a 7-year-old girl wanted, who'd taken time out of her schedule, time that she valued more than gold, to help someone she barely knew. The gifts weren't about the material value. They were about her showing up, about her caring, about her choosing to see them as people who mattered. He'd felt overwhelmed, not just by the gifts themselves, but by what they represented. Love, not the romantic kind, at least not yet, but love nonetheless, the kind that shows up without being asked, that helps without expecting gratitude, that sees someone else's child and wants to help her be well. He'd gone directly to her office. They'd already left the building to go back downstairs, and he'd found her pretending to work, though her eyes had been watching the door, waiting for him. "Emma," he'd said, and she'd looked up, vulnerable and scared. "Thank you." "How is she?" Emma had asked immediately. "Better. She's going to be okay. She's already asking when she can go back to school. The fever broke this morning." Emma had nodded, and David had seen tears in her eyes. Real tears, not the careful, professional tears she sometimes allowed herself. "I'm glad. I couldn't stop thinking about her being sick. I kept worrying that she was alone, that she was scared. I needed to make sure you had what you needed to take care of her." David had walked around her desk and pulled her up from her chair and held her. It was the first time he'd held her, and she'd stiffened for a moment, not used to physical affection, but then she'd relaxed into him, had let him support her weight, had let herself be held. It was then that David had realized he was falling in love with her. Not with Emma Sterling, the billionaire CEO, not with the success story or the $9 billion empire or the Forbes cover. With Emma, the woman who cried over a sick child she'd never met, who was learning what it meant to care about someone other than herself, who was brave enough to be vulnerable in a way that most people never managed. With Emma, the woman who'd spent her entire life convinced that she was broken, only to discover that underneath all the armor, she had the capacity for the most profound, genuine love. "I'm falling in love with you," he'd said quietly, and he'd felt her stop breathing. "I don't know if that's okay. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I needed to tell you." Emma had pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were wet with tears. "I'm terrified," she'd said. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be in love with someone. I don't know how to open my heart knowing it could be destroyed." "I know," David had said. "I'm terrified too. My wife died. I know what loss feels like. I know what it means to love someone and lose them. But you know what I also know? I know that the worst pain in the world doesn't compare to not loving at all. I know that the most beautiful thing in the world is when someone sees you completely and loves you anyway. I know that you're worth the risk, Emma. Even if this falls apart, even if we fail, you're worth the risk." The barriers between them had seemed insignificant in those late-night conversations. Yes, Emma was wealthy and powerful, and David was her employee. Yes, they came from different worlds. But in those moments, it hadn't mattered. What mattered was that they saw each other. What mattered was that Emma had learned that the girl on the beach had never died. She'd just been buried under ambition and protection. What mattered was that David had learned that you could have very little in this world and still have everything if you had someone who truly loved you. Then everything changed the night Emma wanted to meet Lily. David had been nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. His hands had shaken while he'd helped Lily get dressed that Saturday afternoon. He'd picked Lily up from school, had taken her for ice cream like it was a regular weekend, but inside he'd been a tornado of anxiety. She'd asked why they were getting ice cream on a day that wasn't a special day, and he'd said they were going to meet someone important. "Like Aunt Jessica?" Lily had asked. Aunt Jessica was his sister who lived across the country. "No, not like Aunt Jessica," David had said carefully. Someone who's become very special to me. And I think she might become special to you too." He'd picked her up from school and had taken her for ice cream, and then he'd sat her down on a bench and had said, "There's someone special I want you to meet. Her name is Emma, and she's very nice. She's the CEO of the company Daddy works for." "A CEO?" Lily had asked, her eyes going wide. "Like in the movies?" "Kind of, yes," David had said. "She's a very smart and powerful woman, and I really care about her." Lily, with the devastating honesty of 7-year-olds, had asked the question that had terrified David. "Is she your girlfriend? Is she going to be my new mom?" David's heart had clenched so hard it hurt. He'd thought carefully about his answer, wanting to be honest without being overwhelming. "I really like Emma," he'd said. "I think she's wonderful, and she really likes me too. So maybe one day she could be like a mom to you, but we're still getting to know each other. What I want to do is introduce you two and see what you think. Does that sound okay?" Lily had thought about this seriously, the way she often did. She'd licked her ice cream cone and said, "Will she still be the CEO after she meets me? Or will she become something else?" David had almost laughed at the question, had realized that his daughter was wise in ways he was still learning. "She'll still be the CEO," he'd said. "She'll just also be someone who knows and cares about you." "Okay," Lily had said. "Let's go meet her." Emma had been waiting in the park near Lily's school, sitting on a bench near the duck pond. She'd been terrified. David could see it in the way she'd held herself, spine rigid, hands clasped together in her lap, the expression on her face that she got when she was bracing herself for a challenge. The CEO who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions in her sleep was scared to meet a 7-year-old. It had somehow made her more lovable, more human. When Lily had seen them, she'd started running, the way children do, without any awareness of caution. Emma had looked panicked for just a moment before she'd stood up, and then Lily had been there, stopping a few feet away, suddenly shy. "This is Emma," David had said gently. "Emma, this is Lily." Emma had knelt down so they were at eye level, and for a moment the two most important people in David's world had looked at each other. Emma looked at Lily like she was trying to memorize her, trying to understand her, trying to be worthy of meeting her. Lily looked at Emma with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child, assessing her the way only children could. "Hi, Lily," Emma had said softly. "I'm Emma. Your dad has told me a lot about you." "Have you told her about the time I tried to rescue a bird, but it bit me?" Lily had asked David, and Emma had smiled. A real smile, not the careful professional one. Instead of offering gifts or trying too hard, Emma had just asked Lily questions. What did she like? What was her favorite book? Did she like the ocean? What did she want to be when she grew up? The questions had been genuine, and Emma had listened like the answers mattered, because they did. Lily had answered in that comprehensive way children do, words tumbling out without filter. She'd loved the ocean and wanted to study marine biology. She loved books about animals and mysteries. Her favorite was Charlotte's Web, and she'd cried at the end because Charlotte had died, but her egg sac had saved her children. She wanted to save animals like Charlotte had saved Wilbur. Somewhere in the first 5 minutes of conversation, Lily had taken Emma's hand. It had been instinctive and pure, and had broken something in Emma that had been broken before. Emma had felt tears start to prick her eyes, in public, in the middle of the park, in front of David, and she'd let them come. She'd looked at David with an expression of such wonder and gratitude that he'd understood she was experiencing a shift in her understanding of what was possible. They'd walked together to the duck pond, Lily between them holding both their hands, swinging slightly when they stepped up onto the grass. Lily had told Emma about the charter school she was hoping to get into, about the science program there, about how she wanted to study bioluminescent creatures that glowed in the ocean. Emma had listened and had asked intelligent questions that treated Lily like her thoughts mattered, like she was someone worth understanding. Emma had told Lily stories about building her company, and Lily had been fascinated. She'd asked how Emma had decided what to build, and Emma had said, "I saw a problem that needed solving, and I realized I was smart enough to solve it. I just had to believe in myself enough to try." Lily had nodded seriously, filing away this information like it was treasure. Emma had taught her about coding in a way a 7-year-old could understand, using a metaphor about recipes and following instructions. She'd taken out a napkin from her pocket and drawn a simple flowchart. Lily's eyes had gone wide. "So you're like a magician?" she'd asked, and Emma had laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from joy, not politeness. Emma had listened while Lily talked about her dead grandmother, David's mother, who Lily remembered vaguely, but whose absence she still felt. Emma had asked kind questions about what Lily's grandmother had been like, what made her special, if Lily missed her. When Lily's eyes had gotten wet with tears, Emma had knelt down again and had let her cry against her shoulder. This woman who'd been so afraid to let anyone close. "It's okay to miss people," Emma had said softly. "It means you loved them, and love doesn't go away even when people do." "Did your grandma die?" Lily had asked. "I didn't know my grandma," Emma had said, "but I lost someone very important to me, your dad's wife, Sarah. She was wonderful, and she would have loved you so much. She was your mother, and it's okay to be sad that she's gone." David had watched them together and realized that something profound was happening. Emma wasn't trying. She wasn't performing. She wasn't attempting to be anyone other than herself. She was present, genuinely present, with his daughter. And his daughter, with the wisdom of children, was accepting her. As the afternoon had turned to evening, they'd stopped at a small restaurant for dinner. Lily had sat between them, and David had watched as Emma had cut Lily's chicken into bite-sized pieces without being asked, had helped her with her napkin, had listened attentively while Lily had explained the ecosystem of tide pools. It was domestic, simple, real. It was everything Emma had never experienced growing up. When they'd said goodbye in the parking lot, Lily had hugged Emma. It had been spontaneous and genuine, and Emma had held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like she might break if she held her wrong. She'd closed her eyes and just held her, and David had seen tears stream down her face. "Will I see you again?" Lily had asked when she'd pulled away. "I hope so," Emma had said. "I really hope so." In the car driving home, Lily had been quiet for a long time. David had let the silence exist, not pushing her to process faster than she was ready for. Finally, she'd asked, "Is Emma going to stay in our lives?" David had said, "I hope so, baby. I really hope so, but that's something that's going to be your choice too. How did you feel about meeting her?" Lily had thought about this. "She's sad," she'd said finally. "Sadder than you are. But she's trying not to be sad when she's with us. She's trying to be happy." David had felt his heart break a little at how perceptive his daughter was, how she could see through Emma's armor to the vulnerable person underneath. "She is trying," he'd agreed. "And I think being with you helps her with her sadness." "Good," Lily had said. "I want to help her." But the universe, it seemed, had other plans for how this story would unfold. The media found out about them. No one knew how. Probably office gossip, probably someone seeing them together, probably the simple reality that secrets don't stay secret when the billionaire CEO is involved. The story broke on a Tuesday afternoon. Sterling Tech, CEO Emma, Sterling dating company janitor, the headlines screamed. The articles ranged from sympathetic to salacious, but the underlying narrative was the same. The untouchable billionaire had fallen for someone beneath her station. Society pages wondered if it was real or a publicity stunt. Business competitors used it as ammunition. Emma's own board started expressing concern about her fitness to lead while involved in such a publicly questionable relationship. Emma's phone rang constantly. Her publicist begged her to make a statement. Her board members demanded she end things. The media staked out her building. It became a spectacle in that way the internet makes spectacles of people's lives. David was investigated. Articles appeared about his past, his marriage, his financial struggles. Internet people debated whether he was a gold digger or whether Emma was slumming for authentic experience. Lily's school called because parents were concerned about the scandal's effect on the student body. The media crisis had hit with the force of a tsunami. David's phone had started ringing with reporters who'd found his number somehow. His apartment building had staked out cameramen. Lily's school had called, not to support them, but to express concern that the other parents were worried about media attention affecting their children's learning environment. It was code for, "We're distancing ourselves from this scandal." David had wanted to disappear. He'd wanted to protect Lily and save Emma from the fallout of his own inadequacy. He'd thought about how his wife had died, how she'd left them, and how now he was bringing Emma into a life that seemed cursed, a life that only knew loss and hardship. He'd considered walking away, had spent nights lying awake wondering if he was selfish to stay, if his love for Emma was costing his daughter's peace. He'd almost convinced himself it was the right thing to do, the noble thing, the thing a real father would do. But Emma had called him at work. "Don't you dare," she'd said, and her voice had been fierce. "Don't you dare walk away from me because you think you're protecting me. I've spent my entire life having people leave me. I've spent my entire life convinced that I was too much or not enough. I'm not letting you be another person who abandons me because you think it's noble. We face this together." So they'd faced it together. Emma had called an emergency board meeting. Her publicist had advised against it. Her lawyers had warned her it could be used against her. But Emma had decided that the only way through was truth. She'd streamed it publicly. Her board members had objected, had argued that this was a terrible precedent, that she was airing private company matters on the internet, that she was being emotional and irrational, but Emma had overridden them. She'd sat at the head of the table in her immaculate suit, composed but no longer cold, and she'd done something she'd never done in her entire career. She'd been vulnerable in public. "I need to tell you why David Hayes matters more to me than sterling technologies," she'd said, and the room had gone quiet. And then she'd told them. She'd told them about being poor and hungry and terrified that she'd never be enough. She'd told them about her childhood, about her mother working 3 jobs, about the shame of poverty, about the drive to escape it. She'd told them about building an empire, about the relentless achievement, about the moment she'd realized that success was empty. She'd told them about that night when David had fixed her computer, about seeing the photo of the girl on the beach and realizing that she didn't recognize herself anymore. She told them about asking a maintenance worker if she was pretty, and about him seeing her and telling her the truth, that she was beautiful but sad, that she deserved to be happy, that she was worth loving. She told them about a man who'd lost his wife to cancer, who was raising his daughter alone, who worked 2 jobs, who gave everything he had to his daughter and still found it in himself to be kind to her. She told them about learning what it meant to love someone, not because of what they could provide, but because of who they were. She told them about his daughter, about a 7-year-old girl with a dead mother and a father who was holding her together, and about how being with them had taught her what actually mattered in the world. "I've spent 15 years building the world's view of who I should be," Emma had said, "and I was dying inside. I was alone in a building full of people who wanted something from me. I was rich and powerful and completely, utterly alone. David didn't fall in love with my bank account. He didn't pursue me because I could advance his career or make him rich. He fell in love with me because he saw me, not the CEO, not the empire, not the achievement, me, the person underneath all of this." She'd paused, and the room had been so silent it felt like everyone was holding their breath. "And I fell in love with him because he showed me that the girl on the beach never died." She'd just been buried under ambition and protection and the desperate need to be enough. She's still in here. Emma had placed her hand on her heart. She never went away. She was just waiting for someone to help her remember that she was allowed to be happy, that she was allowed to need people, that love was worth the risk of being hurt. Emma had stood up. Her voice had gotten stronger, more certain. I built this company. I made it a $9 billion empire. I did that. But I would trade every penny, every achievement, every accolade if it meant I could have what David and his daughter have. I would burn it all down to have what we're building together. Because love is more valuable than money. Connection is more valuable than power. Being known is more valuable than being feared. She'd looked directly at the board. If you want me to choose between this company and him, I choose him. Full stop. If that's unacceptable to you, if you can't support my choice to be a human being with love and a family and a life outside of this office, then I'll step down, and you can find someone whose priorities align better with quarterly earnings. But I'm done living a life where I'm successful but empty. I'm done choosing achievement over connection. I'm done being alone. The room had gone silent. The board members had exchanged glances. Some had looked disapproving. Some had looked thoughtful. Some had looked like they were reconsidering everything they knew about Emma Sterling. And then one of them, Patricia, the oldest one, a woman who'd been in business for 40 years and had probably faced her own battles as a woman in a male-dominated industry, had started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Then the others had joined in. Not all of them. Some had sat with arms crossed, unmoved. But enough had clapped that the message was clear. Emma Sterling had just changed the narrative. The optics had shifted overnight. Twitter had erupted with people praising her courage. News outlets had pivoted from scandal to inspiring love story. The headlines had changed from CEO dates company janitor to billionaire CEO chooses love over empire. Some people still thought it was foolish. Some people still called David a gold digger. But the acute pressure had eased. The story had become about a woman choosing vulnerability, choosing connection, choosing to be human. When Emma had gotten home that night, David and Lily had been waiting for her in her penthouse apartment. He'd watched the press conference on his phone at work, had felt his heart break and rebuild itself all at the same time. He'd called Mrs. Rodriguez and asked her to watch Lily, and then he'd gone to Emma's building. He'd taken the elevator up to the penthouse, and when she'd opened the door, he'd cried. She'd walked toward him, and instead of saying anything, he'd just opened his arms, and they'd held each other for a long time. Later, Lily had arrived with Mrs. Rodriguez, and David had sat Lily down and told her what had happened. He'd explained that sometimes grown-ups got scared and did mean things, that sometimes people on the internet said hurtful things because they didn't understand. He'd told her that Emma had been very brave. Lily had asked if Emma still wanted them, and David had said yes, always. Then Lily had climbed up onto Emma's lap, and the three of them had sat together on the sofa in the penthouse apartment, holding each other, three people who'd found each other despite impossible odds, and had decided that love was worth fighting for. The resolution of their story hadn't been a fairy tale ending where everything was perfect. It was better than that. It was real, complex, full of growth and learning and the daily choice to show up for each other. Emma had stepped back from day-to-day operations at Sterling Technologies to focus on strategic leadership, which meant more than just a title change. It meant she actually had time for a life. She'd called meetings at 3 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. She'd taken Fridays off sometimes. She'd hired a new CEO who was brilliant and visionary and had different values than her, who believed that profit and people mattered equally. Under shared leadership, the company had thrived. Emma had discovered that she could have power without having to sacrifice everything else on the altar of achievement. She'd started a foundation focused on education for low-income families, funneling her wealth into changing systems that had once trapped her. She'd put David's mother on the board. She'd passed the year before, but Emma had wanted to honor her memory through the work. She'd built scholarship programs that didn't just provide money, but also mentorship, connection, understanding that poverty wasn't just about money, but about feeling invisible. David had been offered a position in Sterling Technologies' IT department by Emma's new CEO. He'd been nervous about it, worried it was just a favor because he was dating the boss. But he'd gone through the interview process, and he'd been the best candidate. He'd gotten the position because he was good at the work and deserved it. His salary had tripled to $80,000 a year, which seemed like a fortune after years of struggling. He and Lily had moved into a bigger apartment with windows that let in real light, natural sun pouring in instead of the dim greyness of their old place. Lily's room had become a paradise of books and art supplies and a telescope for studying the stars and the sea creatures she loved. Emma had become a part of their lives in a way that had surprised no one. She'd started spending weekends with them. She'd attended Lily's school events and had cried at Lily's science fair when Lily had won first place for her project on bioluminescence. She'd taught Lily to code, using games and stories, teaching her that logic and creativity weren't separate things but deeply connected. She'd taught her to think like an entrepreneur, but also to remember where she'd come from, that the goal of business should be to solve problems and help people, not just to accumulate more and more. Most importantly, Emma had shown Lily what it meant to be a woman with power who used it kindly. She'd shown her that strength and vulnerability weren't opposite things, that you could be ambitious and also tender, that you could want success and also want love, that these things weren't mutually exclusive. One afternoon, about 8 months after they'd started officially living together, Lily had asked Emma if she could call her Mama Emma. They'd been making dinner together, and Lily had been stirring something on the stove while Emma had been chopping vegetables. It had been such a mundane, domestic moment that when Lily had asked, it had caught Emma completely off guard. "You don't have to call me anything," Emma had said carefully. "I know your mom was Sarah, and she'll always be your mom. I just want to be here for you." "I know," Lily had said seriously. "But you're here. You're choosing to be here. And I love you. So can I call you Mama Emma?" Emma had cried the kind of happy tears that had surprised her with their intensity. David had held her while she'd cried, and he'd whispered, "You're her mom, Emma. You're as much her mother as I am her father. You're allowed to be loved like this." They'd gotten married a year after that first night when David fixed Emma's computer, in a ceremony that reflected who they'd become together. They'd gotten married on a beach that looked a lot like the one in Emma's old photo, the one where she'd been barefoot and happy and hadn't yet convinced herself that happiness wasn't allowed for her. Lily had been the flower girl, and she'd walked between them down the aisle, holding both their hands. Her flower basket had been overflowing with wildflowers, not expensive roses, but real, messy, beautiful wildflowers. Emma had worn a simple dress, her hair down, her smile genuine and unguarded. It was a designer dress, yes, because Emma was wealthy and could afford beautiful things, but it was simple, elegant, unfussy. It was the dress of someone who was comfortable in her own skin. David had worn a suit, not expensive but well-fitting, a suit that made him feel handsome and confident. He'd cried when she'd walked toward him, and Emma had cried too, and Lily had giggled because they were both being silly. The ceremony had been small, just their chosen family, the people who truly knew them. Emma's mother was there, healthy and proud, watching her daughter choose love and vulnerability. David's sister had flown in from across the country. Mrs. Rodriguez, their old babysitter and neighbor, had been there. A handful of friends and colleagues who genuinely cared about both of them. The vows they'd written were not the traditional kind. David had talked about seeing Emma for the first time in her office and recognizing, even then, that there was something broken and beautiful about her. He'd talked about falling in love with her bravery, with her willingness to risk being hurt again after being hurt so many times. He'd promised to see her, really see her, every single day, to notice her, to value her, to choose her. Emma had talked about being lost and finding her way because of two people who'd shown her that she was worth saving. She'd talked about how loving David and Lily had taught her that success without connection was meaningless, that achievement meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. She'd promised to build a life with them that was based on love, not fear, to be present, to be vulnerable, to let them love her without constantly waiting for it to be taken away. And when they'd kissed, Lily had clapped her hands and shouted, "We're a real family now." And they were. Not perfect, not without complications, not without the occasional reminder of the vast differences in their experiences and resources, not without grief about Sarah and all the ways things could have been different, but real, true. Built on a foundation of seeing each other completely and choosing each other anyway, over and over again, on hard days and good days, in joy and in sorrow. Emma learned what it meant to come home to people who loved her, not despite her wealth, but in addition to it. She learned what it felt like to have someone trust her completely, to have a daughter who believed she was the smartest and kindest person in the world, to have meaning beyond herself. She learned that fixing a computer on a random Tuesday night had been the most important accomplishment of her life, more valuable than any company, any profit, any award. She learned what it meant to be a mother, to worry about a child's heart, to want to shield her from pain, while also knowing that pain was part of living. She learned that being a parent meant your own needs sometimes came second, and that was okay, that was love. She learned that she could be powerful and also vulnerable, that these things weren't contradictory. David learned that you could start over, that losing everything didn't mean you had nothing left to give, that sometimes the best things in life came exactly when you'd stopped expecting them, when you'd resigned yourself to a life that would be good enough, safe enough, manageable. That love had less to do with circumstances and more to do with choice and courage. Every single day he chose Emma. Every single day she chose him. Every single day they chose Lily, and she chose them. He learned that he didn't have to be perfect to be a good parent, a good partner, a good person. That showing up, being present, trying his best, and admitting when he failed, that was enough. More than enough. That was everything. And Lily had learned that families could look however they wanted them to look. That love wasn't about traditional structures or what other people thought was right or proper. It was about people showing up for each other, about being seen and valued, about mattering. She had two parents now who both loved her fiercely, who both put her first, who both believed she could be anything. She had a mother who'd learned to smile, a father who'd learned to hope again, and a family that had been built not on blood, but on choosing each other despite every logical reason not to. She learned that love was a choice, that vulnerability was brave, that the people we choose to let into our lives matter more than anything we could ever achieve. Years later, when Lily was older, in high school and thinking about college and her future, she would sometimes ask Emma about that night when David fixed her computer. "Did you know?" Lily would ask. "Did you know he'd change everything?" Emma would think about that moment, about seeing her own photo and being asked if she thought she was pretty, about a kind man with eyes full of understanding, looking at her like she was beautiful, not because of what she'd built, but because of who she was. She'd think about how she'd almost walked away, how she'd almost convinced herself that love was too risky, that vulnerability would destroy her. "No," Emma would say, But I think maybe I was waiting for him without knowing it. I think maybe my whole life, from the moment I was a hungry kid convinced I had to earn my way to being worthy of love, I was waiting for someone to help me remember that I was more than my job, that I deserved to be happy, that I was enough just being me. He didn't save me. I don't believe in that narrative. But he helped me save myself by showing me that someone could see me, completely and honestly, and love me anyway. Lily would smile and say, "That's a good love story," and Emma would agree, because that's what it was. Not a fairy tale about a billionaire saving a janitor or a janitor saving a billionaire, though people had tried to make it that simple. It was a story about two broken people learning that they weren't broken. They'd just been waiting for someone to see them, really see them, and love them completely. It was a story about how sometimes the most important moments in your life happen while you're just doing your job, just showing up, just being present. It was a story about how asking a simple question, "Do you think I'm pretty?" could change the trajectory of two lives forever. It was a story about found family and real love, and how vulnerability, which we're all taught to fear, is actually the bravest and most beautiful thing we can offer another person.